I am Kirk Essary, and my paper, Calvin's Interpretation of Christ's Agony at Gethsemane, an Erasmian Reading, examines the prospects of Erasmus' influence on John Calvin's interpretation of the scene of Christ's having been sorrowful and fearful in the Garden of Gethsemane, which appears in Matthew chapter 22 in synoptic parallels. I argue that it looks like Calvin was influenced by Erasmus's De Taedio Iesu, which was a text published in 1503 and which recounted an argument that Erasmus and John Colet had in 1499 at Oxford over the question of what Christ in fact feared whenever he was said to have feared in the garden. And both Erasmus and Calvin argue that Christ feared for his own death, among other things. But the idea that Christ feared for his own death wasn't a very popular idea in the history of interpretation, especially in patristic times, as patristic authors argued that this would have been unbecoming of Christ. However, Erasmus and Calvin argue that, based on Chalcedonian Christology, if Christ was in fact truly human, and fearing death is something that humans do, and that they do not necessarily sinfully, but just as humans qua humans, that Christ must indeed have feared for his own death, and that this wouldn't have been undignified at all. More specifically, Calvin and Erasmus both use the same passage to the same end from Ambrose's Expositio in Lucam. They both also invoke the monothelite heresy as a point of entry for discussion of this particular problem, and they both also make very similar comparisons between Christ's passions and ours as they relate to original sin. And so I conclude that it looks like Calvin probably did use this text, or at least that there are pretty compelling reasons for arguing that he must have read Erasmus's text, and that he in fact sides with Erasmus against John Colet on the question of what the object of Christ's fear was in the Garden of Gethsemane.